Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective, or should I say, good day, mate. Today, we're going to be talking about British politics. Now, if you're American like me, the whole thing just feels like a TV show that you don't even watch. But this is actually, it turns out there is a world outside of the United States, and they have many countries with their own governments and various political incidents. And we're actually going to be talking about somebody named Jess Phillips today. Now, I kind of know about her. She's a what you might call like a feminist. She has at times I've heard like downplayed the significance of problems that men face in the UK, and some would say overstated the victimization of women. But whether or not that's true, maybe we'll get into today. But we're going to be talking about the fact that in light of a recent tragic murder of Sarah Everland, her name was Sarah Everland, right? And Everard. Oh, excuse me. There was a typo in the tweet that I was tagged in, I think. Anyway, Sarah Everard was killed by a male police officer, in my understanding, and then Jess Phillips spoke to Parliament. That's like the British version of Congress, and she listed the names of all the women who had been killed by men in the past year. I think she is implying heavily, or if not stating explicitly, that there is a severe problem of men abusing and killing women in the UK, leading to the need for more laws or for the increased enforcement of laws. And those are two very different things, by the way, which we can also get into today. So, believe it or not, this is not me doing a solo show on British politics and Jess Phillips. We've actually got a couple of people here to help me on this. We've got first my co-host, a guy who, frankly, himself is not British. Nikos.
Thanks, Rucka. But let's go to our guest, who is the big name today.
That's right. We've got Spiked Online's editor, the one and only Brendan O'Neill.
Hello. How's it going?
Pretty good. So I'm just trying to learn about this. I'm trying to understand what exactly. Okay, is this outrageous? So I'm personally not outraged by the video that I saw of Jess Phillips listing the names. It kind of reminds me of what's taking place over the weekend with a rapper named Lil Nas X. He's doing a homosexual acts with Satan in his latest music video, and a lot of people are upset by this. And I'm like, in light of what we've seen in the world in the last few years, this is what you're outraged about? Like, I understand you might not want your toddler to watch this, but Jesus Christ, no pun intended. So now, well, jumping over to England, I guess let me ask you, Brendan, are you particularly outraged by this, or do you see the outrage as valid?
No, I'm not outraged at all. I think it's perfectly legitimate for Jess Phillips to read out the names of women murdered by men. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. That's a feminist act. Lots of women appreciate the fact that she does that. She does it every year, in fact, on International Women's Day, I think. She reads out the names of women killed by men. That's fine. I'm not offended. I'm not outraged. But having said that, Jess Phillips is possibly Britain's most preposterous member of Parliament for so many different reasons. I mean, just to give you a bit of background, she's a Labour MP, so she's a kind of leftish or pseudo-leftish MP. She pretends to be this incredibly working class voice of the people style member of Parliament, but in fact, she spent much of the past 4 years trying to overthrow the vote for Brexit. She represents an area called Birmingham Yardley. All 4 wards in Birmingham Yardley voted in heavy numbers for Brexit, and yet she tried to prevent Brexit from happening. So she has acted against the democratic will. She has acted against the people's will. She has discarded working class votes when they don't really suit her agenda. So I have a number of problems with her to begin with. And then in addition to that, I do think her style of feminism is very misanthropic. It takes a view of the world as an incredibly dangerous place, men as a dangerous species, women as these kind of victimized wallflowers who need as much protection as they can possibly get. It paints just an unrealistic picture of life in modern British society. I'm not necessarily offended by that, but I think it can have destructive consequences on the way men are perceived and on the confidence of women. And I think it would be far better if politicians told the truth about the UK, which is that women have a better position in society than they have had at any point in history. And men murdering women is a rare event in the scheme of things. And I think if we were told that honest picture, there'd probably be less fear and less division.
And actually, the problem nowadays with putting everything through the prism of gender wars and gender politics is it makes more difficult to find actual solutions to the problem. So, for example, we saw something which I couldn't believe it. The party of the loyal opposition in the UK saying something like rape is effectively decriminalized in the UK or something like that, which is a comment that has to do with the fact that what is the ratio of cases that go to court, of accusations of rape and cases that go to court and found guilty. So when you lose proportion in that way, and when for example, Jess Phillips mentioned that in a way cars have more value than women in this country because she saw an incident of various people in uniform giving tickets to parked cars. And she said something like, I wish these people were taking care of me on a Saturday night. Now, it is true that quite often in Saturday nights, you see scenes on the high street that quite often are not nice. But as Brennan said, painting this picture that if you're a woman, you're in danger, but also you need the protection of men or the police. In a way, this brings the clock back. This brings the clock to a view that women are weak and women are fragile and actually need the protection of men. So for me, it's very difficult, to be honest, though, to find where the balance is, because from discussing with women, they will tell you that, yes, indeed, I do feel insecure quite often when I go out, or in my self-defense class all the time, we have women who show up and you understand that they have experienced something bad and that's why they don't want this to happen as well. So the question is, what do you say to a woman who says, you know what, okay, I get what you say, gender tribalism is bad. Yes, maybe some people have an agenda and they put it in gender terms, which we're going to discuss in a while, and this is bad. But still, I feel insecure when I go out and you guys cannot figure it out because you're three men in a show, so you cannot understand it. So what would be the reply to that, Brendan?
I think I do think there is a serious problem with the gender wars, and I think they have become one of the main means through which authoritarianism is enforced today. That's the problem I have. Feminism has completely lost its way as far as I'm concerned. It seems very detached from the more positive feminism of the early 1900s and the 1970s. You know, those two waves, firstly when women got the right to vote, and then essentially when women got the right to work and the right to engage in society on an equal footing with men. Those were two great leaps forward for humankind, wonderful events. I support them enormously. But after that, the third and fourth waves, or whatever wave we're on now, I lose track, maybe we're on a fifth wave now. But the feminism after the first two waves has become this very destructive force, and it's become anti-men, and also it's become anti-values that are associated with men. I don't think these are necessarily male values, but they are associated with men, such as autonomy, confidence, a desire to stand up for yourself, a desire to fight your corner. All of this stuff is now increasingly referred to as toxic masculinity. It's psychologized and pathologized as a destructive way of living. Young men in particular, boys in schools, are continually educated out of this way of thinking and encouraged to see themselves as vulnerable and fragile and to get in touch with their feminine side. So the reason I have my main concern with the gender wars is not that it's ranting feminists. I think people on the right have a tendency to caricature feminists, in fact, and I hate the term feminazi. If I ever hear the term feminazi, I just switch off instantly. I think it is just deeply offensive and really inaccurate, actually. So it's not ranting feminists, and it's not because I feel sorry for men. Men can stand up for themselves. It's because I think it's an anti-humanist politics, and it's an authoritarian politics, which lends itself to new forms of social indoctrination through the education system, new forms of policing, new forms of control in the workplace, where gender ideology is often used to control male behavior, especially if men are getting out of line and threatening to go on strike or whatever else they might be doing. All across society, I think so-called feminist ideas are being weaponized to the end of social control. And that's the reason I have a problem with it. And to the extent that women might feel unsafe in the streets, I think that itself is a product of the culture of fear, because there's no need to feel unsafe. I mean, of course, sometimes you have to have your wits about you, but that goes for men as well. I mean, I've been mugged, and I was once beaten up when I was 19 years old by a gang of feral youths. That was very unpleasant. Men get attacked often in pubs and pub fights. You know, this stuff happens. You have to be sensible, you have to take precautions, but you can't live in fear. And the constant encouragement of women to live in fear, I think, is incredibly destructive, and it undermines the liberation that women have won over the past 50 years.
I wonder if the government's actual function is a little bit unclear these days, and for a long time. I mean, if the government's job was to strictly protect the rights of the individual, then whether or not women are safe out in the street might be something that a journalist could help illuminate. But it ought to be clear that the government's job is to pass laws that are, strictly geared towards protecting the rights of the individual, and the police's job is strictly to investigate crimes that are, or complaints, to investigate complaints, which I think many people, I mean, I don't know about UK again, but I imagine, like America and like most semi-free, somewhat, semi-free countries, mixed economy countries, the function of the police is sort of split between actually investigating complaints and also sort of policing behavior like drugs, prostitution, and other sort of so-called preventive crimes.
Tweets, when it comes in the UK, tweets. I have someone from the government calling me every day to check if I'm in my quarantine after
Lockdown
my travel
stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway,
yeah.
Continue.
Well, so I mean, people might say, okay, so the police they're enforcing all these BS laws, but so where's the harm in that? It's just a little bit of extra manpower. But really, it's we end up, and again, most of my experience is obviously in America, but I imagine most Western industrialized semi-free countries have the same problem, which is that to the extent that the government does what it should not be doing, it spends a lot less time and is in fact disincentivized. But the police are disincentivized to actually invest complaints. So let's say a woman calls the police and says she was raped. I think in today's world, the police are much less likely to investigate that complaint, and this has been shown in a number of big scandals where rape kits were stored away and never sent into the lab. Many testimonials in crazy high numbers of police just completely dismissing complaints. Whereas obviously the police can't wait to go bust a drug dealer, for instance. So my whole thing is like the government's job needs to be clear, and then they need to do that job well. And the more the government becomes this sort of agent of, fixing all the problems that ail society, and any group that has a grievance, bring it to us. We love new issues. We love finding new creative solutions. The more the government gets into that business, the less they actually do their job.
One comment on that, and then we'll go to Brennan in the super chat. So here's the issue with things like rape. As you said, it's unacceptable if some claims are not properly investigated. The problem is quite often we get lost in my opinion, completely useless discussions, such as whether there is a rape culture. And we lose the essence that rape is something horrible and how can we fight it? Or when we fuse on, so things, for example, when we fuse things like sexual harassment, sexual assault, with things such as uninvited attention, then also it's difficult to recognize, wait, the one is a crime, the other is criminal behavior, the other is something which is not nice. So making these issues part of the culture wars also means that then you have a reaction from the other side, which is very unhealthy, which goes back also to darker views and darker ideas about women. That's why I really believe that if the proper, let's say, feminist, the proper pro-women thing to do is to take these issues and see them with some dry objectivity and not as part of a greater agenda or of a problem of the patriarchy, because actually this is going to make their solution more difficult. Okay, let's see the super chat.
Should I read it?
So,
or are you reading it?
Yeah, I'm reading it from
Okay.
Marilyn. Thank you very much, Marilyn, for the super chat. I think the Me Too movement treated women as if they have no agency. Is this part of feminism? So the Me Too is quite too large, but let's leave our guests to treat this question. So Brennan, Me Too, agency, and if you want also, how does this relate to the discussion we're having today?
Yeah, I think Me Too has definitely undermined women's agency or treated women as if they are lacking in agency. And that's one of the problems I have with feminism more broadly today. One of the main issues I have with modern feminism is that it strikes me as being anti-women, because it treats women as being morally inferior to men, lacking in the kind of moral autonomy and moral confidence that men enjoy. Therefore, we need censorship of pornography or censorship of erotic images in order to protect women's sensibilities. We need clampdowns on rape culture, which can include everything from actual rape, which everyone agrees is one of the most heinous crimes you can commit, right through to men's magazines or rude TV shows, all of which are said to contribute to this kind of amorphous idea of rape culture. And on campuses across the Anglo-American world, you see lots of arguments for women needing safe spaces, needing protection from supposedly misogynistic speech. And all of this contributes to a view of women as pretty weak, lacking in the same resolve as that men have to negotiate public life without, the scaffolding of state protection and the scaffolding of censorship. So it demeans women, I think. Modern feminism demeans women. And Me Too really summed that up, because a lot of these cases, they're really shocking. I mean, of course, some of them were genuine cases of male sexual abuse, and they absolutely deserve investigation and probably some form of punishment. There's no question about that. But some of the cases were just really, they were incidents in which, a woman could have left that situation, could have applied a sense of force or rejection against the man who was making unwanted advances. And women were absolved of all responsibility for removing themselves from a particular situation. And some of the, I won't name names because I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone in particular, but some of the cases were clearly incidents where women had found themselves in a possibly undesirable situation and want us now to believe that there was no way for themselves to remove from that situation. So it painted a picture of women almost as children, as lacking meaningful agency. And lots of older feminists, in fact, made that point. Lots of older feminists felt uncomfortable, especially in France. There was a real backlash against older French women who tend to have slightly different values to American and British feminists. There was a backlash by these women saying, look, women have to take some responsibility for the situations they put themselves in. So yes, I think Me Too chipped away at the idea of female agency. And I think feminism more broadly does that. And that's destructive of the ideal of freedom, because you can't really have freedom unless you trust human agency. So that's why it's important to defend the idea of human agency.
So the French feminists who Brennan mentioned, one of them was Catherine Deneuve, who actually made this point that this undermines the agency of women because it sees them as incapable of taking care of a situation. Now, be careful for the bad faith viewer. We're not talking here about situations where the use of force is involved. But here's another example, and I want both your point of view. So a British journalist, Julia Hartley Brewer, who has talk radio where Brennan is often a guest, she described a story once where there was a politician in a formal dinner or something who touched her knee twice. And she told him, you do that again, I punch you in the nose. And she said that was the end of it. Now, I found this very powerful in a way. But then many women would say, yes, but I don't have the guts to go to someone and say, I'll punch him in the nose. Or the man might be more physically imposing, therefore I'm afraid to tell him that. So the usual question is, why do I have to find myself in this position where I threaten the use of force or I imply the use of force? And why do I have to go through this where I go out and men come all the time and talk to me, or they become a bit more, they put their hands, or they don't leave me alone. Yeah, okay, it's part of society, but it's annoying. I don't want to be part of society.
Well, my view is that that's life. It is part of society, and so long as we're talking about people making clumsy advances or talking to you or chatting you up in a bar or chatting you up in the street, so long as we're talking about that realm of life rather than someone grabbing you or pushing you or forcing you, all of which are criminal offenses, I think we have to accept that as part of life. And it's actually a fairly small price to pay for living in a free society. And I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we've had a sexual advance that we didn't necessarily want. And part of growing up is finding your way around that and discovering the ways in which you can push back and say no or do whatever you want to do. That's part of becoming an adult. And I'm worried that if we send this message to young women in particular, that a man putting his hand on their knee or offering to buy them a drink or putting his arm around their shoulder, that is a terrible thing that they can't possibly deal with on their own. I think that will contribute to the infantilization of young adults and make them think that they can't cope with everyday life. But the other thing that strikes me about lots of these cases too, and I know this is sometimes a controversial point, is the question of what kind of sexual abuse stories get flagged up and what kind of sexual abuse stories are ignored. So at precisely the time when the front pages of the British press were all about politicians putting their hands on middle-class women's knees and, chatting middle-class women up in bars and being, basically a bit creepy. That was the kind of huge story in the British media for a long time. At the same time, there were lots and lots of incidences of working class girls being abused and in some cases raped by grooming gangs who largely were made up of men from with Pakistani heritage. And, there was a real sense of ethnic tension and sexual tension in some of those communities. And that was largely ignored. That was not made part of the Me Too movement. That didn't trend online. There were no hashtags of solidarity. So there's a class element in this as well. And I think a lot of the Me Too movement is, sharp-elbowed middle-class women propelling themselves forward on the back of this campaign and ignoring cases of sexual abuse which are inconvenient to their narrative. So I think we have to factor that in as well.
I'll push back on one point here, that sometimes when I do chores or things that excel, that doesn't need a lot of mental clarity, I have on the background on the TV playing in Greece, and sometimes you watch old TV series, let's say from the 90s, and indeed the level of what everyone would agree was sexism is very visible, and today is okay, shocking, but it's noteworthy, let's put it this way. So why not say, look, we've had the talk, and now we've understood that some types of sexism, such as, for example, you slap her and she likes it and things like that, which was big in popular culture and in Greece. Today, we realize that it's not cool because we've had the talk. Why not do the same, for example, so that in 10 years, being the creepy guy who doesn't know how to do an approach and doesn't know how to be socially pleasant is also a thing of the past? What's wrong with that? By the way, that's not devil's advocate. That's a genuine question.
Yeah, I think, but the question is I'm not saying that we should allow creepy men to be creepy. That's not, I'm not saying that, freedom for creeps, that's not my rallying cry. So absolutely something must be done. But the question is, what's the best way to do it? Do we want to reorient education around, correcting boys, presenting boys as a problem, telling teenage men that, they're going to become animals unless they change their behavior and get rid of their toxic masculinity? Do we want that, which strikes me as quite authoritarian and insidious, and probably quite harmful to young boys who I think do want to become strong and confident and so on? Do we want to do that? Or do we want to encourage the kind of thing we've just been talking about, where if a creep is a creep, a woman slaps him or tells him to F off, or her friends get involved, or their male friends who they're with might push him and say, go away. I think those kind of normal social corrections of creepy behavior are far preferable, because that is ordinary people taking action, using their own agency to correct the behavior of their fellow citizens. And I'm entirely in favor of that. I think more and more people are doing that. I think creeps are a kind of dying breed for the most part. It was more pronounced amongst older generations than it is today. So I think that pushback is happening. I think that's positive. And I think the problem I have with campaigns like Me Too is precisely that they grate against that kind of pushback by suggesting that women are incapable of dealing with these situations, and therefore we need all the authoritarian interventions instead. So I agree, absolutely. Don't let creeps off the hook. Take action against them, but don't call on the authorities to do it for us.
Rucka, do you want to have the last word before we move to Clubhouse?
Sure. I think, obviously multiple things can simultaneously be true. So it is true that we can solve a lot of our social misunderstandings or bring about normative changes benevolently by sharing. Women can share how things make them feel. Men can share some of the struggles they go through. On one hand, they want to be perceived as cool and light. At the same time, they're worried that whatever they do will be perceived as creepy. I mean, there's a lot of conversations that can be had. Also, different men will be perceived differently. Some guys, they can flirt however they want and nobody's really upset by it mostly. And other guys, like the awkward type, he can try to make the slightest attempt at flirting and he's immediately reported to the HR. Just like in verbal expression, I can say whatever I want and people go, oh, there he goes. And whereas a lot of people can say the same thing, the same joke, and people would be horrified because it's just there's just something about different people and the way their personality is sort of tied to their action. So all of that is true. What's also true is that I think causes like the Me Too movement, they attach themselves to legitimate things. It is true that people like Harvey Weinstein corner women and say, come with me to my hotel in exchange for a career, or if you refuse, you will not have a career. I mean, that type of thing, it may or may not be illegal, but it definitely is worth highlighting. And I'm glad women come forth about it. But it is tied, of course, to women who they basically slept with a guy on a first date, regretted it, and now they want to call it rape. I mean, there's a lot of simultaneous things going on, and separating them, obviously is necessary. And again, I want to reiterate that we need to have a police whose job it is to investigate complaints, look at evidence, hand the evidence over to the prosecutor. I'm assuming the British process is similar to the American one, since we probably got ours from you in the first place. And then the prosecutor, if there's enough evidence, takes it to court. I mean, this is a process that needs to be sacred. And the more we turn law into this group discussion where just everyone is throwing their ideas and everyone's idea is just as valid as a political scientist or political philosopher, the more this whole situation gets hectic and out of control. So we really need to be remembering that rule of law is a science, and it needs to be clear and carried out. I know you said that was the last word, but go ahead.
One last thing to throw to the table, which we didn't have time to discuss. Could we say it's sexist if you say these are the women killed by men and leave it there? So, for example, you can imagine someone, let's say, a white nationalist in the US saying, this is the list of people killed by black men this year. And that would be the end. You never hear from that guy again. So as Brennan said, it's very important not to go to the male vulnerability card and say, oh, men here are the victim. But isn't there something tribal when you say, oh, these were murdered by men, as if men is this category where you are part of this group and therefore you have to, oh yeah, you didn't kill them, but there's some questions you need to ask yourself as a man.
Yes, I think that's one of the problems. I think one of the problems with the response to the horrific alleged murder of Sarah Everard. I was thinking earlier today, I couldn't remember the suspect's name. I couldn't. I was trying for ages to remember what his name is, and I couldn't remember it. And it struck me that I think that's because his alleged wickedness has been so thoroughly diluted by the response to this case, because the response to this case has been to say that, you know, being wolf whistled at, or being shouted at, or being chatted up on when you don't want it, that's all on a spectrum with what happened to Sarah Everard. And what you end up doing is presenting all men as problematic, because male behavior is the problem itself, especially masculine male behavior, and all women as victims. So I think that's absolutely right. You know, I don't have a problem with women standing up and reading out names and all those kinds of solemn ceremonies. That's fine, and I'm sure it's a great comfort to many people. But it is tribal, it is identitarian, it is saying something not only about those very small numbers of men who do terrible things, but also about men in general. And that's where it becomes a problem, because when you generalize about a whole section of society, whether it's men, whether it's black people, whether it's Jewish people, whoever it is, then you're always doing something wrong, because we should never hold whole groups responsible for the crimes and misdemeanors committed by certain sections of society. And that's got to be the way to approach all of these problems.
Right. So thank you very much, Brendan. So to follow Brendan, obviously check out Spiked online. By the way, it's been almost a year since we had the discussion with Brendan titled Is Tyranny Here? And when we had that title, people were laughing at us. And here we are discussing vaccine passports, me having to, I'm going to discuss my experience traveling to the UK. It's beyond Orwellian, and all the things that last year would seem completely unimaginable, they have been happening. Anyway, luckily, humanism and reason and science came to the rescue with the vaccines. Hopefully, we're never going to have to discuss COVID anymore, but we'll have to discuss how quickly freedom and how quickly the idea of human agency and the idea of that you can take decisions for your own life went down to the drain this last year. Anyway, thank you very much, Brendan. Thank you, Rucka. We migrate to continue the discussion with the audience in Clubhouse, and see you all soon there. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.